I am the director of development services on Carleton Place, and when Lorraine asked me to come speak, she said, "Come speak about Carleton Place's Heritage Conservation District." I said, "We don't have one," but luckily, as someone who has some academic background in heritage, I have worked on several heritage conservation districts, and this was one of them. So when I was a master's student at Carleton, one of our case studies was to do preliminary work on a heritage conservation district. And this was back in 2011. So the presentation I'm going to give you today is based on that preliminary assessment that we did. And then the final heritage conservation district study and plan that was done by the city of Ottawa, by the planner, Leslie, what's Leslie called? Oh, Leslie Collins, she's still there. So Leslie worked with the residents of a subdivision, and this was very much an applicant-led application. There was a group of residents that were extremely keen on heritage conservation. They were their first time homeowners in the subdivision. They were the original homeowners, or they were people who bought the homes in the subdivision knowing full well the uniqueness that was their little neighborhood. So next slide. So we're going to talk about a little subdivision called Dwyer. Briarcliff was the very first modern heritage conservation district of its time, back in 2013, I believe, when they designated it. So we'll talk about why it in of itself is so unique, but also why the new modern heritage is unique in Canada as well. And then, because the plan has been in place for 10 years, we can talk a little bit about the impact that heritage conservation district has had on the development that has occurred in the neighborhood to date. Thank you. So, Ottawa. Ottawa is one of these great cities that really leaned into postmodern development in the 1950s. So when you think about Ottawa post-World War I, you have to remember that, pre-World War II, not World War I, pre-World War II, Ottawa itself wasn't really considered to be a global capital on the market, either politically or in its built infrastructure. So post-1950s, Canada as a nation really started to lean into our diplomatic role on a global scale. And in doing that, we saw massive federal agency growth to help bolster this new role. But we also started to receive massive immigration influx. And a lot of that led to immigration to the capital, particularly in fields of arts. So Ottawa recognized that in this post-war boom, they really needed to build themselves up as a true capital. And a lot of what that meant was creating a civic pride around its architecture. And so at that time, they were seeing a lot of development into this new modern. And then, of course, the epitome of post-war development is, of course, the emphasis on the car. So Ottawa, not unlike any other Canadian city, saw huge suburban development. Next slide, please. So what is modern from the 1950s? So what we saw was this huge emphasis on new school development, and the Bauhaus School out of Germany. And it kind of spurred this belief that good design comes from functionalism and minimalism, and two specific streams of modern architecture came out of these. The first was the great Lloyd Wright. That, of course, is followed modern, and the understanding that development and good architecture can lean into the natural environment and take its influences from there. The second, and that in and of itself is the design aesthetic of arts and crafts. The second shown here is internationalism, and this is the building, Franworth House out of Illinois, and this was one of the epitome residential designs by Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe mostly designed institutional and commercial buildings. A lot of the iconic towers that you see in Manhattan and even some in Toronto are Mies van der Rohe buildings, but he did also branch into the design of residential buildings as well. Thank you. So the true definition of what modern architecture was in the 1950s was this idea that form follows function. This anybody know what the building is on the screen? It's Old City Hall. It's Old City Hall in Ottawa. And so we'll see it from another angle in a couple slides further on too. But it's this idea that like minimalism is king. If it's not something that's necessary as a function of the building, it doesn't need to be there. So you strip away all of the unnecessary, we'll say, but unnecessary architectural details and elements that simply don't have a purpose in the design aside from aesthetic. So this is what the city of Ottawa really became known for in the 50s. And when you see the downtown landscape even today, there's huge, huge influence even today of this modern infill. Next slide. So again, the upper photo is the former CBC building, also sometimes known as the Deacon Baker building. Great example of internationalism. And if you've ever been to cities in Western Ontario, you'll see that exact same model used in city halls all over. It's the same model that they use for the city of London and the city of Hamilton, and I think even Brampton has one that looks the same. And you'll see it's very similar to the building, the black and white photos below. Again, that's Ottawa City Hall, the old Ottawa City Hall, the exterior as it faces onto the road, and then the interior spiral staircase, which I will verify there's an exact replica of in the city of London City Hall. And then a great example of internationalism again in the Ottawa Constitution. Next slide. So it's not all just about large civic buildings either. Ottawa has a great number of mid-century modern and more modern internationalism designs in residential construction. So this is the Hart Massey House in Rockcliffe Park. Hart Massey, of course, was an architect stemming from the Massey family. And he built and designed multiple buildings in Ottawa, but this was his family home, and it's still standing today. So driving through Ottawa, particularly in some of the suburban areas, you will see great influence as a good modern design throughout the city. So, that's a horrible picture. Sorry, guys. So, in particular, we're going to talk about Briarcliff. So, in the 1950s, acknowledging that there was this post-war boom and a willingness from the city to develop generally, but build out as much housing as possible for their immigration influx, as well as just returning World War II soldiers. The city annexed the former municipality of Gloucester in the east end of the city. So part of that annexation was to accommodate the massive developing federal growth industry. So you'll see, this is a terrible picture, but Blair Road comes right up through the middle of the image, and then to the west, is the NRC. South of this picture is the new CMHC headquarters, and then to the east is what is now known as Rothwell Heights. Rockcliffe is further to the east as well, but it's this huge collection of infill lands, which at that time were largely agricultural, starting to infill into suburban Ottawa. Thank you. So, part of what made Briarcliff so unique at the time was that the estate itself was owned by a gentleman by the name of Edward Kindle. And Edward Kindle bought a parcel of land that had been subdivided off into a 20-acre parcel off of Blair Road. And he was a paleontologist and a geologist that came up to Canada to start staffing out the geological survey for the Canadian government. And he came from the Federal Survey of the States, where he had done years and years and years of research in building that institution and the institution it became before he came up to Canada. And so he and his wife bought this property. They fell in love with it mostly because of its jagged rock outcrops within the landscape, but also the fact that it was still largely treed. So despite the fact that this whole area in Gloucester was mostly agricultural land, this little pocket of 20 acres was not good agricultural land. It was too rocky, it was too obtrusive for conventional agriculture, and so it just remained kind of stale for all these years until the Kindles bought it. And so he purchased it mostly for his kind of summer estate home, And he and his wife built this little house in the middle of the 20 acres and lived there prosperously for many, many years. Until 1959, when he and his wife decided that they were going to divest of their estate. So in doing so, he sold it under the condition that it had to be named Briarcliff. I'll be honest, I don't know the history of where Briarcliff itself came from, but that was one of the conditions of sale. And so in 1959, he sold it to a co-op of 4 landowners that decided that they were sick of the tract-style home that they saw in suburban development, and they wanted to build something truly unique and different to live in. So in doing so, they carved it up into 24 lots, including 1 park. And the purpose of their co-op was to, first and foremost, find a unique piece of land that met their interests, something that would be akin to kind of quality subdivision lots that didn't have to be clear-cut and graded so that they looked like any other suburban lot. But it also provided them with leverage to finance infrastructure, because I don't know if anybody has tried to build infrastructure lately, but even back in the 1960s, it was extremely expensive. And so for the quality of their financing, they found that it was beneficial to pool their own resources between the 24 lot owners and put their own financing into the construction of the roads and services. And then most importantly, they recognized that quality of design was something that was severely lacking in conventional residential development in Canada. And so they decided that they wanted to have this little control mechanism around what type of houses got built and where within the subdivision. So that was really the basis for which Briarcliff came to be a residential subdivision. Next. So you'll see it was composed of 2 streets, really, Briarcliff Drive and Kindle Court. 24 lots total, including the Parkland block, which over here. So block E here is a parkland, and then all the homes are kind of developed around the court and circle. And I will say, at minimum, these lots were carved out to be half-acre lots. You would never, ever see that in standard development of its day. A, it's just not economical, and B, you know, the awkward lotting arrangement that you see on that plan is not something that we typically like to see when we're servicing subdivision lands. Next slide. So I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the houses of Briarcliff that we see today, not all of them. And so because this is a heritage conservation district now, you'll see little stars under each of the addresses for these properties. And the stars identify the scoring matrix that was used to identify whether or not these homes are contributing properties or non-contributing properties. So really, one of the fundamental principles of designing homes in Briarcliff became the concept that you either had to be using an architect-led design, somebody who was stamping the plans, that it was unique, that it met the modernist principles, and that the committee, collective committee of homeowners, all agreed to construct. We'll see how well that went later. Otherwise, there were 4 lots that the homeowners sold to a gentleman by the name of Jack Dirk. And Jack Dirk was just your standard run-of-the-mill tract home builder, but he saw an opportunity to make money and brought money to the table for the infrastructure development, and thus the residents sold him 4 lots. And so in doing so, they mandated that he use CMHC-approved housing designs. So recall, with the creation of CMHC post-war, there was this huge recognition that they needed to build as much housing as they possibly could across Canada as cheaply as possible for returning veterans. And Smith Falls ourselves has several examples of this. And if you've ever done the CMHC archives hunt, you can find all of the original plans for each of the homes. So the first one here, number 4 Briarcliff, is a great example of one of these homes, and it's remarkably untouched. This one, in the actual construction, they did have to make slight modifications to the interior design of the house, not the exterior, but the interior. And so it was ultimately architect stamped, but it was pretty much a true design to the small home catalog that CMHC produced. The second house here is the Hawkins house, I think, at 8 Briarcliff. It's a funny little house, and we're actually going to come back to this one as our case study at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Thank you. 9 Briarcliff, I'd say, is just kind of your run-of-the-mill suburban infill, but it is an architect-led design by Schuler and Barkham. So a lot of these architecture firms, I think there's about 6 that are included in the subdivision. Almost every single one worked in collaboration on the Expo 67 buildings in Montreal. So you can see there's a theme. It's almost like the homeowners found one architect and they were like, oh, you should talk to Buddy over here, who's also really good. So you'll see a lot of the names are the same as we go through the slides. You know, as much as internationalism was on the rise in Canada, I still think it was a very small community. So it's part of the other appeal, and I'll be honest, in finding the photos to go with this presentation, it's quite hard because these homes are set so far back from the street, and that was again one of the criteria that the co-op was looking for when they were siting these homes on the lots. They have very small footprints relative to the landscape open space around the lot. They have a single driveway access point. They all have integrated carports or garages hidden away wherever possible. Front doors are almost completely obstructed. Again, find me a front door on either of these houses. Like that just wasn't the focus. It was all about minimalism and reducing the visual impact of the homes on the street, which is quite contrary, really, when you think about what urban design has become. The second house is probably the most iconic house within the subdivision, and this was the Kemper House, and it was designed by a gentleman by the name of James Strutt. And James Strutt was an iconic architect of the 1950s, and he designed the first wooden structured reversed parabolic roof. Okay, so if you think about what a parabola is, go back to grade 6 math, you know, you've got this structure that's completely inverted. And he's built this structure out of wood, the first of its kind, and he did it on his own house over in Gatmore Park. And this house became kind of a homage to his own home that he sold the designs to the Kempers. So very unique house, big windows, full wrap on all 4 sides with this very iconic roof line. The rest of the house, I'll be honest, if you see it from the street, is all garage. Not a great sense of presence on the street, but from other aspects of the road, it's really quite an iconic house, kind of on an outcrop of rock, hidden within the trees. Next slide. Again, these damn trees getting in the way. So 12 Briarcliff was just kind of a run-of-the-mill house, and I'll be honest, trying to find pictures of this one, I almost wonder if a diplomat lives there, because on more recent photos, they've got it all washed out on Google, like they don't want you to see it. So I don't know who's there. Clearly very top secret. 16 Briarcliff, again, is another CMHC small model house. Cute little thing. This one actually has a tree growing up through the middle. You can't see it from the aerial photo. But on the floor plan, you can see that it's cut with atriums around a tree that grows up through the middle of the house. Very, very long. Next slide. 17 Briarcliff, again, you're going to see the same names coming up on the helms again. This one has a very low profile roof. Believe it or not, there is actually a slope on that roof, but it's very, very low profile. And that was one of the key design features that a lot of these modern homes had. Something that was either flat or low slope, very low profile, hugging the earth, and kind of blending into the landscape wherever possible. Modern design, particularly on the residential side, you'll see a lot of clean lines, very rectangular form and function in the openings of the building. And again, you'll see that kind of repeated through the rest of the buildings. 18 Briarcliff is another one that's hidden away within the landscape. So not a great photo. Next. And then, 21 Briarcliff, again, your kind of standard run-of-the-mill house. This one actually did have an addition pre-heritage designation, where even at the time the restrictive covenant still binds on title from the original co-op. And so it resulted in very strict guidelines on the design of a rear deck. So even though the deck itself wasn't visible from the street, they had restrictions on what they could do with said deck. And I don't know how they did it, but it was definitely flammable, which the Ontario Building Code would tell you cannot do. So I can't guarantee you they got a building permit. But the heritage side was upheld. And then, of course, Kindle Park. So Kindle Park itself is a very naturalized landscape. There's an earthen trail that cuts through it, great maple sugar bush, but not a lot else going on. And again, it seems to be very in keeping with the landscape. Even when you look at the public streetscape within the subdivision, you're talking about a very narrow asphalt road pathway, no curbs, no sidewalks, minimal naturalized drainage, which again was very much, of the moment in modern architecture. Next slide. And then my favorite, One Kindle Court. So the lady and gentleman who own this house bought it from the original Butler family when Mrs. Butler decided to render the home. They hired an architect to do an immaculate restoration of the home. It actually won several architecture awards and heritage awards on both fronts. But the Butler home is a fantastic example of the international design, probably one of the best in Ottawa and Nova State. And it was Danielle and John who approached the city on behalf of the rest of the neighbors to come forward with the idea of a heritage conservation district. Next to them, you'll see 5 Hingle Crescent, another CMHC small house design kind of tucked away into the bush. Thanks. And again, just some ordinary infill, rounding out the modern homes on the street. Next. And as you get further down Kindle Court, I don't want to confirm that this is what happened, but it certainly looks like these were the lots that went through development at the later stages. And in my opinion, you start to see some compromises in the value of the intended covenant as originally proposed. So 12 Kindle Court in particular, regardless of the fact that it's an architect design house, it certainly does not have that aesthetic feel that some of the earlier homes had. Yeah. And then we have 14 Kindle Court, and this is what I would call an architectural nightmare. I have absolutely no idea how it got built. I think, like 12, it was likely one of these lots where they just couldn't come to agreement about what good architecture was, and so the co-op eventually gave up on upholding their covenant, and thus we have this. So, needless to say, this is a non-contributing resource within the district. When the heritage planners went through and scored each of the properties, this one did not meet the criteria, and thus it is there. We recognize it as an integral part of the history of this landscape, but it's certainly not a valuable heritage attribute contributing in the same way as, say, the Butler House. 15 Kindle, to contrast, is much more in keeping. You see that sunken front door, very strong rectangular planes, and the low sloping roof. Next slide. 16 Kindle, again, I feel like this is the epitome of like 1960s design. If you were going to buy a house in the 1960s, this would be it. This one actually has had a fair amount of renovation, none of which has required a permit to alter, which I thought was interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And then there is one, for those looking for a lot, there is one lot left in the subdivision, 17 Kindle Court. Beautiful tree, nice outcrops of rock. If you two think you can uphold the intent of the covenant, I highly recommend you reach out through Ontario Land Registry and find a property owner. Next slide. And this is the last one, the piece de resistance. It was the last home that was constructed in the subdivision. It's tucked away at the end of the cul-de-sac, and it is another award-winning house. Zoocasa tells me it just sold for $4.2 million. And it does sit right next to that vacant lot if you're looking for kind of an idea of what property value is out there. So it was a beautiful, beautiful home, the only one in the subdivision designed by Alex, what's his last name there? Hutton, who was a architect again who collaborated on Expo 67 and the mega build that was undertaken in Montreal at that time. It's not as strong a contender of internationalism as the Butler House, but you can certainly see that it still has that strong internationalism influence. I did add the Zoocasa listing photo, which shows that the wooden paneling has been painted. And I'll reserve my opinion on what I think about the paint job. But it is an excellent example of how heritage conservation districts so rarely include criteria for painting on buildings. It's not something that to date has been the sword that planners want to die on. And so they've left it out of a criteria within the heritage conservation district, and you do not need a permit to paint the exterior of your building, which is how that happens. Next slide. So in evaluating the district, you'll see there are several homes that are non-contributing, identified in beige. Some of them, the first two in the subdivision, I'll be honest, we didn't even cover off in the slideshow because they're not worth referencing. And then the monstrosity around the court is listed there as well. So when they evaluated the character of these buildings, it was recognized that as much as the architectural character was important in evaluating these homes, it was much more about the story of the environmental character and the actual landscape that these homes sit in. So they weighted the criteria of architectural character and environmental character at equal 40%, and then for good measure, they topped up with historic character as it pertained to people who lived in the homes, events that took place around the design of the homes, and things like that. Overall, the statement of significance that has been included in the Heritage District does lean into the fact that it's not just the architecture, around the subdivision that makes it significant and important. It's the story that comes with how it was developed and why it was developed that makes it unique. Like I said earlier, there's lots of examples of postmodern and modern subdivision infill in and around Ottawa. This one, I'd say, is probably one of the best. Sorry, I also have a helpful. So like with any good heritage conservation district, it's important to establish what your key objectives and purpose is of doing the designation. In this case, the planners recognized that there was a significant sense of place established within the subdivision, and that became the key purpose and objective for the designation. They looked at creating structures that were They looked at making sure that the contributing structures were the ones that leaned into protection the hardest, and recognized that the non-contributing structures are kind of a moot point. They're there, we recognize them, they tell part of the story, but architecturally they're not doing anything to the neighborhood, and if they change, they change. As with the Perth Heritage Conservation District, the principles of the Venice Charter, and then the standards and guidelines for historic places in Canada leans into repair over replacement. That's a pretty fundamental principle across heritage conservation. And so always, first and foremost, we look to repair building materials that are there before we ever look at replacing. Where we do have to replace, we match as closely as possible with like material and design. And we make sure that we're not looking for conjecture when we're modifying structures. So we don't want to take artistic liberties in trying to, create an idea of why design choices were made. We either know why it was done or you don't, and you don't try and falsify the information or tweak. We carefully design additions. There's an acknowledgement that a lot of these homes in the 1950s and 60s don't function in the way they need to for modern life. And we know that the best way to protect a heritage building is to find a use for it. And so if that means making alterations to the building to make it livable, then you do it. But when you do it, you want to make sure that you're not doing it in a way that Disneyfies the building. You're not taking a design that would be from the 1950s and trying to apply it in today's methodology. You're looking at something that is of its time and stands apart and is clearly recognized as being a later addition. And then finally, no demolition. I mean, the monstrosity on Kittle Court, maybe, but generally speaking, any of the contributing buildings are going to stay. They're staying as is, and they are not going to be subject to demolition permits and good thing. Next slide. So, defining the attributes. And this is really where the rubber hits the road in any good heritage conservation district. It's about defining the character-defining element within the neighborhood and identifying themes within the neighborhood that can be generalized across development. Not every house is going to contribute in exactly the same way, but they should all at least meet these kind of general themes. And those are the things that are most protected within the subdivision. So in this case, and a lot of these we've already talked about, these lots are all heavily treed. There's heavy protections on tree preservation and land clearing. Limited building materials and pallets are used. Flat or low slope roofs. Minimal entrances. Again, most of these homes, the entrance is so far tucked away you'll never find it. Good luck trick-or-treating in the neighborhood. Rectilinear planes. Exterior cladding is limited to brick, stucco, or concrete, not your typical heritage conservation materials, but certainly for something in mid-century modern design, that's what you're going to see. Rectangular windows with no trim, and when I wrote that, Lorraine, I thought of you because you're such an advocate for mullions, and I thought you'd lose it if I told you not to have mullions on the building, but obviously the mullions are not going to make sense here. Ground-hugging profile of the design. Modest footprint, again, that high concentration of landscape open space around it, integrated garage and carport, and then that huge open space to house ratio. Next slide. All right, so let's test this. So this is 8 Briarcliff. It's a box. From the street, all you see is garage. There are some windows on the upper floors that had a lovely secondary structure in the backyard. I don't know when that was added, but evidently it didn't have a permit. It was all in all in rough shape when it was purchased by a new property owner in 2016. Fast forward to 2021, this is fairly modern, and actually if you go and take a look at the street view of this property, it hasn't even been updated yet. But what happened was 8 Briarcliff was originally designed with a raised living space, and the ground floor of this property was all parking. It was just a giant garage, and all the living space was on the second floor. The new owners decided that was not a lifestyle that they wanted, and so they set about to rehabilitate and add new residential space to this development. Scope of work included new roof joists, trusses, window replacement, removal of the staircase that led to the front door off the second level around the side of the building. They reclad the entire building with stucco and added a new garage structure with a breezeway connecting it to the building. They also put in a massive addition at the back to double the square footage of the footprint and an in-ground pool. So switch. So here's what we got. So long term, they recognized, the Heritage Panel recognized that in order to ensure the conservation of the structure, somebody actually has to be living in it. And if the design, as originally proposed, is not conducive to having someone live in the house, then it's doing no one any favors. So the committee was extremely supportive of this addition. As it comes to the windows, they did replace with aluminum windows, which the committee felt were appropriate and fitting because they met the same massing and trim details as was original to the house. They did make several changes to the openings on the structure. So you'll see on the ground floor, on the front profile, where there were 2 massive garage doors, there are now windows. And they filled them in so that the massing of the opening is almost identical to what the garage door was itself. Where they removed the primary front entrance on the second level, they blasted in as a new window. So you still have that perceived massing and opening of a door. It's now just a window. And again, the committee said that was respectful and didn't change the intent of the designation. They also put a huge addition at the back, which you can see really clearly kind of on the bottom. That's the new one, with the cantilevered second floor, which is very popular in modern design. But again, that's a whole new addition of the building. So while it kind of plays homage to those mid-century modern attributes that we saw in other buildings, it's very clearly not original to the structure. It's contemporary, it's distinguishable, and more importantly, it's hidden from the street by the original building. And so driving through, you never know that the square footage of this house has essentially doubled. As far as the landscaping goes, because they did put this massive pool in the backyard, they did have to do some tree removal, and the trees were replaced at a 1-to-1 ratio to infill around the landscaping to preserve the tree canopy on the site. So to me, what's most interesting about this particular renovation project is that when we talk to prospective heritage property owners, they have this misconceived notion that the house that they're buying has to be exactly as is. Every feature has to be lovingly restored. There is no possibility for renovation or inclusive new design in the building. And I think this is a great example to demonstrate that that's not the case. And it's really no more laborious to undertake a proposal like this in the context of heritage conservation as you would in any other construction. So this particular case not only did it need its heritage permit to put the addition on, but it also needed a number of minor variances. And so it was going with the planning committee anyways. This was just a second application that went with it. So there's no additional backlog process and policy. There's marginal costs associated with considering the impacts of the heritage attributes. You've already had to have an architect for a project of this size, regardless of the covenant on title. You're already going to planning committee, so you've already got site plan fees to the city. What is an additional heritage permit that's processed in front of you? So I'll leave you with that. I hope I haven't offended anybody by introducing modern heritage. And I believe the last slide is just one last look at the Butler House, which again, this is from the other street outside of the subdivision. You'll see it's all glass. It's absolutely spectacular. Right? Yes. Oh yeah, so like, again, hard to get photos of houses in here because the entire thing is a sugar bush. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think it was probably challenging. But I think they accepted that as kind of one of their key principles, right? You're not going to go in and blast out rock or pull around for a connection for septic systems. Like it was recognized that the key value of this subdivision was in that natural landscape, and you have the privilege of being able to put your home here. Yeah. Oh God, no. So what made this subdivision so unique was that it was applicant led, right? A group of homeowners bought a piece of property. They decided to establish their own restricted covenants